When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Domestic violence is a crime that should never be tolerated. Yet every week in England and Wales, 2 women are killed by a current or former partner. In this programme, we'll reveal how, in 2 separate cases, evidence from expert witnesses helped put 2 violent husbands where they belong, behind bars.
I've covered a lot of gruesome murder cases. Paul Heming is without doubt one of the nastiest, conniving individuals that I've ever had the misfortune to come across.
And we'll reveal how another abusive partner thought he had outwitted the law, but hadn't reckoned on an expert witness.
There were 7 bone fragments, which contained cut and saw marks.
Forensic entomologists can help in an investigation in many different ways, and one of the prime ones is to try to estimate how long someone's dead. We're able to build up a picture of what happened to that person from the point of death until they were found, and this can play a big role in the investigation.
May 2016, Milton Keynes. 31-year-old Natalie Heming is reported missing from the home she shared with her partner and 3 young children.
Natalie was my youngest sister. She was funny, she was kind, she was an amazing mum. The day that it all happened, the usual thing, I was on the school run. My mum phoned me and she said, "I can't get hold of Natalie." And I said, "Well, she's at work, Mum, you know, she'll ring you when she finished." And she went, "No, you don't understand, Jo. I haven't been able to get hold of her since she left my house on the Sunday." That instant, my stomach just dropped.
Investigative journalist Nick Britton covered the case.
2 days after Natalie went missing, her mother made the phone call to the police saying that her daughter hadn't been seen of or heard of, and this was very unusual for her. And she was extremely worried. Of course, at that stage, it was a missing persons inquiry.
Natalie's partner Paul told police that as soon as the children were in bed, she went to stay with a friend. But this did not sound likely to Natalie's family.
As a mum, I would never leave my children, and I would never just disappear without telling somebody. So the fact that she'd been gone for that long and she hadn't told me or Kerry or my mum where she was going firstly, that the fact that the children were just left. Everything about that is just wrong.
As police made further inquiries, they became increasingly suspicious of Natalie's partner, Paul.
He got caught out very quickly in the lie that she was with a friend, and the friend's name that he'd given, he didn't realise we knew her and had her number. So all of those kinds of things, I think it was very obvious to the police very quickly that something was very, very wrong.
The unusual element of this case is that, of course, it was a missing persons, but the police had suspicions very early on that Paul Heming was responsible. And so it quite quickly turned from a missing persons case into a murder investigation, yet it was a murder investigation without a body. For the police, this presented a real problem because the clock was ticking. It's very difficult and very rare, actually, to get a conviction for murder without a body.
Police studied CCTV for clues, both to Natalie's whereabouts and her husband's movements around the time she disappeared. But after 3 weeks, there was still no sign of Natalie.
That breakthrough came when a man was out mowing some grass, just mowing a meadow. He smelled something that he didn't like. He thought it was probably a dead animal. He had a look, and he saw the bare legs of a human being. And that human being was Natalie Heming.
All this time, Natalie's family had been waiting for news.
I had a missed call from our family liaison officer, and so did Kerry. And I remember we just looked at each other and said they found her. It was almost a relief, because 3 weeks of not knowing, it's that constant, you're sort of living on a knife edge, you know, you're waiting for your world to implode. And so getting that phone call, as horrific as it was, it suddenly felt like closure.
Now that she had been found, police needed to find out exactly how long Natalie had been dead.
In Natalie's case, this time frame is incredibly important because what we know is she was caught on CCTV on the Saturday night out with her boyfriend. She was last seen on Sunday, but then nothing. Police didn't know where she was. They didn't know where she had gone. Of course, Paul Heming told the kids that she had just gone away.
If detectives could prove when she died, it could tie Paul Heming to her disappearance and her death.
If the police know exactly how long the body has been there, it will really help them knit together their case from when the person was last seen alive.
Police began a forensic examination, but after 8 weeks, were still no closer to establishing a time of death. Until one of the team contacted expert witness Martin Hall, an insect specialist at the Natural History Museum.
It was actually a young scientist who I had mentored myself, so I knew that her collection of insects would be good. She came to the Natural History Museum and passed over the insect specimens, and I was able to begin my part of the investigation.
As an expert witness, Martin has a unique set of skills.
When someone dies, they immediately start to decompose. And the pathologist can use several clues to determine how long they've been dead in that sort of 3-day window after death. But there's a huge amount of variation between different bodies in that 3-day window. And beyond it, it's extremely difficult for a pathologist to determine a time of death. However, our insects can then take over and help us. They become almost the only tool that pathologists can use. The insect biological clock keeps ticking and can then become almost the only clue as to how long someone's been dead for.
Among the insect evidence were blowfly larvae recovered from Natalie's body and around the crime scene. To calculate a time of death, first, Martin had to identify which species of blowfly he was dealing with.
The life cycles of all blowflies are very similar, so egg to larva to puparia to adult fly, but the rates of development can vary. So even between sister species of the bluebottle fly, there can be quite a big difference. So it's very important to get the identification correct if you want to get the timing right. The species of blowfly that we found on the body of the victim were bluebottle blowflies, and they were of two species, Calliphora vomitoria and Calliphora vicina. And it was quite interesting that vomitoria was the most abundant species. This is a more rural species in wooded areas.
This was a crucial discovery. It allowed Martin to establish a timeline of events around Natalie's death.
So So the fact that vomitoria was so dominant compared to vicina is consistent with the body having been placed at the scene soon after death, rather than having been stored indoors for some time.
But detectives needed more. It was critical they could prove exactly when Natalie had been killed. While Martin continued his analysis, they looked more closely at their prime suspect, Paul Heming.
When I first met him, honestly, he just seemed like a normal bloke. But then Natalie always said he had two faces. He had the face that we all saw and the face that she lived with.
During the 10 years that he and Natalie were together, it turned out that she had reported him to the police for domestic abuse. He had thrown a telephone at her head, cutting her head open, and then refused to take her to the hospital before assaulting her again. Eventually, when he did take her to the hospital, left her with the chilling words, "If you tell anybody about this, I will kill you." She did try to leave him.
Whenever their relationship had ended previously, it had always been in an argument or chaos. But this time it was planned, it was organised. She had, for the first time, really made the decision that this was it. She wasn't going back. It was all amicable, it was perfectly civil. He was going his way, she was going her way. It was the end of the relationship. I think it was a couple of months, she'd started talking to this guy at work, just a nice guy, and I think she suddenly realised that actually there are nice guys out there that don't do the things that were happening to her. And then that weekend, she's spent the weekend with him.
Detectives now asked if Paul Heming could have murdered Natalie on Sunday night when she returned to the family home. If expert witness Martin Hall could provide a time of death, they'd have their answer. Once again, it all hung on insect's life from the crime scene.
So these specimen tubes contain larvae of Calliphora vicina, the blue bottle blowfly, and they look quite different in size. The ones here are much bigger and these are smaller, obviously, but they're actually the same age, 48 hours old. And it's just simply the fact that these ones here grew at 27 degrees and these ones here at 21 degrees. If you don't take into account temperature, then there's no way you can tell how old the insects are. In a way, unlike us, they don't just age in days, they age proportional to heat as well.
For that reason, Martin had to allow for the Great British weather while making his calculations.
So this is a typical data logger. Basically, they enable you to put the temperature recording device at the scene where the body was found, and then you can relate the temperatures from the data logger to those at a nearby weather station for the same period. You can then use the data from that nearby weather station to estimate what the actual scene temperatures would be. What this allowed us to do is then actually work out what temperatures the insects were experiencing and how fast they would develop. In this case, we knew we had Calliphora vomitoria larvae just about to pupariate on the 25th of May. We were able to determine that they must have been laid as eggs on the body in the period 2nd to the 5th of May. So our evidence that the insects must have found her body in the period 2nd to 5th of May confirmed that she must have died very soon after last being seen alive.
This new evidence now helped link Paul Heming to Natalie's murder. And by piecing together the clues, the history of domestic violence, CCTV, mobile phone data, and other circumstantial evidence, detectives revealed what happened.
She had been out with her new boyfriend the night before, and she had returned on that Sunday evening to tell Paul Heming that it was all over. She'd waited until the three kids were upstairs asleep in their bed, and then broken the news to him that she was leaving him. Heming flew into a violent rage. He beat Natalie Heming to death and then took her body, wrapped it in a rug and buried it in woodland 30 miles away.
police charged Paul Heming with murder, preventing the lawful burial of a body and obstructing the coroner. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment.
I've written and covered a lot of gruesome murder cases and a lot of very bad individuals. Paul Heming is without doubt one of the nastiest, conniving, destructive individuals that I've ever had the misfortune to come across. He still continued to deny it. He almost seemed to revel in it, this defiance, right to the end, even as he was being led to the cells, as he mouthed the words, "I enjoyed every minute," to Natalie's distraught family.
For Natalie's family, the work of the expert witnesses and police played a huge part in the verdict.
I'm massively grateful for all the work that they've done. And in terms of the police as well, I wish we'd had the opportunity to actually speak to all of them, because I know the dedication and hours that they put in, that, you know, some of them weren't going home and things to their own families so that our family had closure. You know, that's amazing.
It was curiosity that got me into science. So being confronted with a different type of evidence of this kind was interesting and a challenge in a way.
October 1999. Holbeck, Leeds. George Eckersley has reported his wife Denise missing. The events that followed caught the interest of criminal psychologist Ruth Tully.
George and Denise Eckersley had been married for 4 years and were planning a trip to Europe. However, just before they were due to go, George phoned the police and reported his wife missing.
Denise was nowhere to be found. The couple's car was missing. Denise's daughter from a previous marriage was getting anxious.
Denise Eckersley, who was 47 and had 4 children, was reported missing from her home in Holbeck in Leeds on October the 12th.
Police began to investigate and discovered CCTV footage of a woman who looked like Denise walking near the beach in Cleethorpes, nearly 80 miles away. But there was more to come.
Several days later, a letter arrived, seemingly from Denise, which basically said that she'd been unfaithful and couldn't go on. Even more worrying was that her belongings were found on a beach, along with a bottle of vodka.
Among Denise's belongings was a handbag containing a key to a locker at Cleethorpes railway station. There, police found a holdall packed with her clothing. It seemed Denise had run away and then taken her own life, just as the letter described. But not everyone was convinced.
Denise's daughter raised concerns about the handwriting in the letter, which she said was not her mother's.
Police continued their search for signs of Denise until the remains of human bones were discovered at a warehouse half an hour from the Eckersleys' home.
This industrial estate on the outskirts of Brighouse, just off the M62, is where the human remains have been found, but police haven't revealed the exact location.
The bones were discovered in the ashes of a bonfire at the premises. And most suspicious of all, it was the workplace of Denise's husband, George.
These events rocked the local community. George was well known and people believed him to be a kind-hearted man. They couldn't believe what had happened.
Denise Eckersley's disappearance was looking increasingly like murder, and her husband the prime suspect. But police had no idea if the bones in the ashes were actually Denise's. They needed an expert witness and turned to forensic osteologist Martin Everson.
The police brought in some fragments of bone and asked me to examine them. It seemed to me that some of these fragments very probably could have been human. So we asked the police to bring in the rest of the material. So over the next few days, they came in with half a dozen containers, and in total there were approaching 3,000 fragments of burnt bone, nearly all of them no bigger than the tip of your fingertip.
Martin spent the next few weeks sifting through the fragments.
I found a number of skeletal fragments that had to be human. Phalanges, fingertips and toes. Parts of the cranial bones that clearly had sutures.
Once he knew they were human remains, Martin began to build a profile of the victim.
There was nothing to suggest that this was a juvenile. They all appeared to be adult bones. They were all quite gracile, so this wasn't the skeleton of a robust male. This was a fine skeleton and therefore more likely to be female than male.
Martin next looked for evidence that could reveal more precise details about the victim's identity and made a breakthrough.
There were some molar roots of teeth that allowed some degree of age estimation of the remains, an adult, and a single porcelain premolar crown. Typically, the enamel crown is destroyed by heating. However, in this instance, there was a porcelain crown which had survived the burning process and could be compared with that of the missing person during life.
Dental records confirmed it was a match to Denise Eckersley. As Martin analysed the bones more closely, they began to reveal a chilling story of her death.
There were 7 bone fragments which contained cut and saw marks. The bones that somebody might attempt to cut through if they were dismembering a body. And they were of different shapes, which showed that a sharp-bladed instrument had been used, which had left V-shaped cut marks, and the saw had been used, which left box-shaped cut marks, clearly diagnostic of a saw of a certain size. There were striation marks on the bones, which showed where the saw had cut through the bone.
Denise's body had been cut up and then burnt. Police strongly suspected George Eckersley of planning and carrying out his wife's murder, but still needed more proof. Detectives turned again to the letter apparently sent by Denise before taking her own life. The letter was sent to a forensic laboratory for testing, where scientists found more incriminating evidence.
DNA on the envelope was found to match George Eckersley, Denise's husband.
Detectives quickly moved to arrest George Eckersley, catching up with him at Bradford Airport, about to board a flight to Amsterdam.
He later admitted hitting his wife with a candlestick, dismembering her body and incinerating it at his place of work.
As Eckersley revealed the details of his crime, it became clear just how calculated he had been.
It transpired that the person caught on camera was actually George, dressed as a woman in a blonde wig. George was engaging in an elaborate charade for up to a month, trying to convince people that Denise was still alive. He drove all around the northwest so that there would appear to be movement. He used the bank card to provide evidence that she was still alive. He even made several emotional appeals to the public and to her to return home so that people would think she was alive, and also wore her underwear so that when it was later found, it seemed worn as if she was still alive and wearing it until the point that he staged the suicide.
In 2001, George Eckersley was tried for his wife's murder. He pleaded guilty.
It's clear that the press really latched on to the fact that George dressed up as Denise to try and impersonate her to fool the police. It was almost put across in a slightly darkly comic way, and I can really see how that would sell papers. It's not something we see every day. It's quite unusual. What we need to remember in a case like this is that there are victims left behind. There's Denise's family, and there are a whole level of people who are affected by this tragic, tragic case.
For criminal psychologist Ruth Tully, George's behaviour gave a fascinating insight into the psychology of a criminal mind.
As a psychologist, what interests me is not just the behaviour within the tragic offence, but it's also the behaviour afterwards. I'd be very interested in assessing George's personality to look at if there were any key traits present that helped him to deceive people so calmly in terms of the lack of chaos afterwards. Quite often I see people who commit a serious crime and genuinely don't know what to do afterwards. They may admit to what they've done, or they may try a rushed attempt at covering things up. But there's something very different in a case where someone goes to such extreme lengths to try and cover up what they've done.
George Eckersley was sentenced to life with a recommendation he serve at least 16 years. Martin's evidence was crucial in establishing the intent and premeditation behind the crime.
We were able to show that this person, the perpetrator, planned this process and went to some length to carry it out. And it was reassuring to hear that the judge felt it had allowed him to say something in their judgment regarding the state of mind of the individual, in as much as it shows forethought and planning.
This was a really complex case. There was a lot of evidence to pick through, but because of George's deception, it wasn't clear what any of it meant. That's where forensic scientists and experts will pick through all of that information to the most minute detail to interpret it correctly to ultimately aid the course of justice.
I think it was gratifying to find something out of 3,000 pieces that actually were relevant. It was good to know that I was able to make a helpful contribution to a major homicide investigation. That was very reassuring.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, we reveal how, in the art world, forensic science uncovered the fakes being passed off as the real thing.
It's very important in these kinds of cases to hold people to account. It can also provide a warning to people who are wanting to buy these kinds of artworks that they need to be cautious.
And we reveal how tiny traces of evidence uncovered at a crime scene helped crack a complex murder investigation.
It was that element of waiting to deliver a fatal second blow that convicted him. And that's what the blood pattern gave us.
It's very gratifying being able to apply this set of skills to work with art. There is a market for deception. I would like to think that what we do is a deterrent.
Hale, Cornwall, 2009, where David Carter once ran an art gallery. Today, the gallery is no longer in business, but back then, it was the place to buy Cornish art, including the works of celebrated local artist Alfred Wallace.
Alfred Wallace was one of the many fishermen who lived here in Back Road West. This was the doorway in which he would stand of an evening.
He was a longshore fisherman in the earlier part of his life, then gave that up and became a local fisherman down in Cornwall. Then he gave that up and opened a kind of a stores where he could sell marine supplies to service the local fishing industry. And he then became, after his wife's death in about the 1920s, an amateur artist.
He couldn't afford canvas. He painted on the walls, on bits of board, both sides.
He was really painting not just what was around him, but what he remembered of what was around him. So he was painting sailboats when it was becoming steamboats and this kind of thing. He painted then through the 30s, never made much money, always struggled.
But when he was 86, he had to go to the workhouse, and there he lived. He painted until he died on August the 29th, 1942.
Over the last 20 years, Alfred Wallace's artworks have become increasingly sought after, as art journalist Georgina Adam has seen.
Alfred Wallace is what they call an outsider artist. An outsider is somebody who's outside the mainstream, who hasn't had training as an artist. He started painting in a very naive style. He didn't have money, so he would paint on all sorts of different things. He might paint on cardboard or on a biscuit tin, anything like that. And he became quite fashionable, and his works can actually sell for up to £100,000 now.
As an expert in Cornish painters, David Carter sold dozens of Wallace's works, and in March 2011, he advertised this painting for sale, claiming it was by Alfred Wallace.
One of the works of art that he sold was called Boats Leaving Newlyn Harbour, and he sold it to a woman for £5,000.
The woman was very pleased with her new painting, but believing it to be by Wallace and knowing his work was appreciating in value, she later decided to sell it and got a shock when the auctioneer told her it might be a fake.
The auctioneer expressed a lot of doubts, and she was very upset, obviously very disappointed, she said at the time, obviously because suddenly her purchase is worthless.
Ben Adams from Cornwall Trading Standards began an investigation. He started by examining the paperwork associated with the painting.
She had been told it had documented history, provenance to it, and it turned out that it was a very vague, patchy history, simply not authenticated by any paperwork.
Ben had a problem. With such little paperwork, all trading standards had to rely on were two differing opinions. One from an auctioneer who said the painting was a fake, the other from David Carter, who insisted it was genuine. What they needed was scientific proof from an expert witness.
I think expert witnesses are frightfully important in the art world, particularly for forensics, but also for connoisseurship. I mean, the artist isn't there to tell us if he painted it or not, so we need some other way of finding out if something is genuine or not.
Trading Standards turned to expert witness Dr. Nicholas Eastor, an expert in detecting fakes. That can involve analysing the brushstrokes, composition, and general style of a painting.
There seem to be a number of artists who come up again and again in forgery. It looks as if the basic reason is that people think that they are easy to emulate. And for example, the works of Jackson Pollock, where you've got drips and splashes and people think these are easy to do. They're not, they're actually quite complicated. This is also the case with the artist Alfred Wallace. I think people mistake naivety for simplicity.
In this case, there was nothing about the style of the painting that rang alarm bells. Instead, Nicholas was more interested in what materials the artist had used.
You get slightly different questions when you get into a wholly self-taught artist like Alfred Wallace. He was using all sorts of different kind of painting materials, so not artist paints. He wasn't going to an art shop and say, sell me a tube of lead white. He was just picking up paints that you might paint your house with.
Wallace's use of everyday materials makes it harder to detect a forgery. But Nicholas has an arsenal of forensic methods that can unlock the secrets of any painting.
I can come in with scientific techniques and demonstrate what the painting is made of, when it might have been created. I can analyse it in terms of the construction and how this relates to the way the original artist would have worked. Just as an example of a painting that might come in for examination, this we actually know is sort of late 1940s. Once we've had an assessment of the painting overall and had a look under the microscope, we're on to sampling, and we have to decide just where to take the samples from. We take the smallest possible samples that's going to give us the information that we actually need. We can sample down in practice to material that's perhaps half the width of a human hair. And so we can just, in practice, the sample should be so small that when you go back to look at the painting, you can't see where the sample has come from. Okay. You might just be able to see that. There's the tiniest black speck. There's enough sample on there for doing multiple tests.
Nicholas applied the same precise analysis to boats leaving Newlyn Harbour and uncovered the first clues to the work's origins.
We found two pigments that were of interest. One was a form of titanium dioxide white pigment that's known as rutile. Now, this is essentially the white pigment that you'll be painting the walls of your house with today, but it came into use in the 20th century. The other pigment we found has a very awkward name. It's called phthalocyanine green. And with the phthalocyanine green, because it was notionally available in the 1930s, you could say, because Wallace died in 1942, it is possible that it found its way into a material. It's slightly different with the titanium dioxide white. This has a complicated history. It was first experimented on as a potential pigment really around sort of 1908 to 10. And then in the 1910s, it was developed as a commercial pigment, finally finding use from the 1920s on.
There are two types of titanium dioxide white, an early version called anatase, and a later version known as rutile. This was now key to solving the mystery.
They only found a good synthetic route to produce rutile-formed titanium white around 1940 or so. And essentially it wasn't available, wasn't used. You don't find it in artworks until well after Alfred Wallace had died. And because we found the rutile form of titanium white in these paintings, we could rule out Alfred Wallace.
David Carter had sold a fake. And now Cornwall Trade and Standards had the scientific evidence to prove it. So they raided his art gallery.
Then obtained a number of items, including 5 or 6 paintings in total, together with a computer, a number of documents, including invoices, receipts. That allowed us to piece together basically the history of the paintings. One in particular was described as an item in the style of Alfred Wallace. Now, that clearly showed that he bought the item effectively as a fake.
The evidence from the raid revealed that David Carter was buying cheap Wallace imitations on the internet from websites with names like Any Old Tat, and then selling them as the genuine article at an enormous profit.
So you've got 3 paintings along the back there, which are all from the same supplier. Those cost around about £500 each. The one on the left was up for a price of about £30,000 to £50,000. That one in the middle there was priced at £20,000 to £30,000. And the one on the right-hand side, that was as much as £18,000. It was sold for £5,000 in the end.
One of the works was a glass fishing float, which was painted with little boats on it, and he attempted to sell it for £60,000, which was an enormous amount of money.
This one was only purchased for £316.77, 20,000% roughly, price inflation. It was clear that we're talking about fraud here. Mr. Carter was being dishonest, basically.
Trading Standards now had enough evidence to press charges. David Carter pleaded guilty.
This is another case where, after all the evidence is put forward, they just say, yep, I did it. It saves us having to stand up in court.
He was sentenced to 12 months suspended. He was also sentenced to paying £50,000, and he was given 200 hours community work to do as well. It's for sure that Nicholas Eastor's work has been invaluable in rooting out such fakes and forgeries.
It's very important in these kinds of cases to hold people to account. It can also provide a warning to people who are wanting to buy these kinds of artworks that they need to be cautious.
In our next story, the evidence was blood. The story it told revealed the killer's lies and put him behind bars.
It looks like the source of the wet blood would have been in front of the shoe. And this is exactly the sort of pattern we might see from a heavy impact into blood.
Heston Motorway Services near London, 2007. A guest has been murdered in one of the rooms. Senior investigating officer at the Metropolitan Police, Tim Grattan Kane, was on call.
It was Saturday, the 15th of September 2007. And we received a call to go to the Travel Lodge at the Heston service area next to the M4 motorway. We went to a ground floor room and had discovered the body of a young man, Gareth MacDonald, totally lifeless, on top of a bed. There was an enormous amount of blood on the bedding, on the sheets, and it appeared at an early stage that the round base of the fire extinguisher, that was the murder weapon, and that had been used to strike Gareth on the head.
Gareth MacDonald was a father of 3 from Prestatyn, North Wales. His death had been reported by his boyfriend, Glenn Rycroft, who Gareth had met online the year before. They were on a trip to visit Rycroft's aunt. Rycroft claimed Gareth was safe and well when he left the room at 7 a.m. But when he returned 15 minutes later, Gareth was dead. It was an horrific story, but for Tim, something didn't quite add up.
It appeared immediately to those officers who attended the scene that this was implausible, certainly not normal, that you would go to a hotel next to a major motorway with many people occupying it at that time on a Saturday morning, and that someone would have come into that hotel, into a particular room, and beaten someone to death.
There were other puzzling elements. There was no sign of forced entry. Rycroft was also stained with the victim's blood, and his fingerprints were on the murder weapon. But he had an explanation for this.
He made efforts to hug Gareth's body, which meant that he himself became covered in blood. And he also claimed that in the rush to deal with them, he'd picked up the fire extinguisher, which had blood on it, and he'd moved it out of the way.
Rycroft's actions had contaminated the crime scene. Finding conclusive forensic evidence now would be a major challenge, so Tim turned to one of the UK's top expert witnesses, Philip Avenel, a specialist in using blood spatter patterns to tell the story of a crime.
What we do is we examine them under a light source, usually using a microscope in order to look and identify absolutely all of the stains, their position, their approximate size and their shape, because each of these things tell us something slightly different about how that stain was deposited.
Any blood patterns on Glenn Rycroft's clothes would have been contaminated when he hugged Gareth, so Philip started his examination with Rycroft's shoes.
The right shoe had some blood staining on it, but there wasn't anything really distinctive on it, whereas the left shoe had very clear impact spatter on it.
While Philip examined evidence from the crime scene, Tim started looking into Gareth's boyfriend, Glenn Rycroft. And it didn't take long to find out Rycroft was already well known to the police.
He had a complex history. He'd been a convicted fraudster who had perpetrated absolutely audacious frauds against friends, members of his own family.
In fact, Rycroft's crimes had already made national news.
Good evening, welcome to the 6 o'clock news.
First tonight, mean, wicked and heartless. Tonight, a former British Airways cabin steward is beginning a 4-year jail sentence for conning his friends and family by claiming he had cancer. Glenn Rycroft from Manchester pretended he had a brain tumour and raised tens of thousands of pounds. He said it was to pay for treatment abroad. Instead, it went on living the high life and a string of foreign holidays.
In 2003, Rycroft admitted 25 charges of obtaining money by deception, a total of £200,000. 3 years later, he started a relationship with Gareth MacDonald, and in his statement to the police, claimed he was now trying to pay back his debts, starting with his own family.
The reason for their trip down to London, Glenn was due to come down to meet his uncle and aunt to give them back £5,000 that he had defrauded from them. Glenn and Gareth had set off from the northwest. They were due to be in London shortly after lunchtime. Glenn had spoken to his uncle and aunt, saying that they were stuck, they were delayed, they were lost, they wouldn't make it at this time, they'd be a little bit later.
But the couple never turned up to meet Rycroft's aunt and uncle.
So what happened that evening is that they went to the travel lodge at Heston Services, booked in for the night. They went for a meal in the service area and then went back to their room. Glenn Rycroft found a fire extinguisher outside their room and took this fire extinguisher into the bedroom with them. He and Gareth had gone to sleep. He'd woken up in the morning, was seen to drive off in their car. He went down the M4. And when he came back, he found Gareth lying on the bed.
For Tim, Rycroft's story just didn't add up. Why had they not gone to meet his aunt and uncle? Where was the £5,000? Why did they stay at Heston Services?
Everything was designed to delay the time when he would have to go and meet his uncle and aunt and hand over this £5,000 that he allegedly had, but we found no trace of.
It was all very suspicious. And back at the lab, Philip was also making some discoveries among the blood stains on Glenn Rycroft's shoes.
The first picture I've got in front of me is a front-on view of the shoe, showing lots of a distribution of spots across the shoe of varying sizes, but many of them very small. The small blood stains won't travel very far, so you can start to get an idea of how far away it was as well, and this showed that the shoe had been close to an impact into wet blood. We also, because of the colour and the texture of the material that the items are made out of, it's not always easy to clearly see the blood. We use some software to convert it into a digital sketch. You can see from this diagram, you can see actually there's a lot more blood on there than you actually see with the naked eye when you're looking at it. So it really highlights there is a heavy impact into wet blood that's happened there.
Rycroft claimed to have found Gareth dead when he returned to the room. But blood pattern evidence on Rycroft's shoes was telling a different story. It showed he must have been in the room when MacDonald was struck. Tim now had evidence rather than just suspicions. But he needed more, so he began to look more closely at Rycroft and MacDonald's relationship.
Gareth MacDonald, at the time of his death, was a 30-year-old young man. He had been married, he had 3 young children, wasn't certain as to his sexuality, formed a relationship with Rycroft. And it became quite clear when you spoke to Gareth's family that he was starting to have concerns about the relationship. He always seemed to be paying for everything.
Tim believed that Gareth was becoming suspicious of Glenn. Text messages confirmed they had been arguing about money. And when Tim expanded the investigation into Rycroft's internet history, he made a chilling discovery.
We took the computer and a load of documentation from Rycroft's home address, an analysis of the searches, how to kill people, whether a blow to the head would kill people.
Chilling as it was, this was all circumstantial evidence. Tim needed more proof of what actually happened inside the hotel room. Blood spatter on Rycroft's shoes showed he was standing close to MacDonald when he was struck. Now, Tim needed expert witness Philip Avenel to work out what happened next.
We looked at the trousers that the individual was wearing, or that were recovered from him when he was taken into police custody.
Rycroft's trousers were covered in blood from when he had hugged Gareth's body.
There was a lot of heavy blood staining on the trousers. This is what we call contact blood staining. So the item has come into contact, it's led against something that's wet with blood, or something wet with blood has led against it. So there's difficulties when you have lots of heavy blood stains and lots of different types of blood patterns all overlaying each other. It then makes it quite difficult to pull it apart and to work out exactly what's there. And that's when you're really looking at the very fine, small detail in the blood.
Philip began a minute examination of the bloodstains on Rycroft's trousers and found a tiny but vital clue.
About halfway up on the left leg, we found 3 very small blood spots, which is blood that's travelled through the air and landed on the surface of the trousers.
DNA testing found these spots were MacDonald's blood, but there was something else. The consistency was different to the other stains. That meant these blood stains were made at a different time.
They were what's known as clotted blood. As we all know, when we cut our hands, then our bleeding will slowly stop and we'll end up with thick, heavy blood, which is clotted blood that's dried.
Philip now turned his attention to the bedsheets. They were also soaked in blood. But amidst the heavy staining, Philip found further evidence of clotted blood, just like on Rycroft's trousers.
We could see where the impact had happened and the blood had radiated out from the point of impact. The initial impact, the blood then starting to flow, and then there's a time delay for that blood to then start clotting, and then there has been a second impact into that blood after that.
To Philip, this was evidence for a timeline of events. It showed MacDonald had been struck once. Then minutes later, as the blood was starting to clot, he was struck a second time.
So we knew there had been an impact into blood after there had been a period of time of bleeding, and typically that is between 3 to 15 minutes.
Philip's analysis proved this was not a frenzied attack. It showed there had been at least 2 blows, and that these blows were minutes apart.
You look at what you've got, you're trying to understand the sequence of events and what's happened, and it's interesting when you can then start to piece them together.
It gave us the definitive answer. DNA wouldn't have done that. We knew they were there. Fingerprints wouldn't have done that. We knew they were both there. But the way this blood arose was a matter of scientific proof. He had been present at the moment Gareth was hit with the murder weapon. And it was that that had sprayed the blood onto his trousers and onto his boots. We will never know whether the first blow was just purely to stun, but what we do know is that the second blow definitely caused his death. Massive injuries.
In July 2009, Glenn Rycroft stood trial at the Old Bailey. Central to the prosecution's case was evidence from expert witness Philip Avenel.
It was that element of waiting to deliver a fatal second blow that convicted him. And that's what the blood pattern gave us. It gave us the definitive answer.
I think a good expert witness is somebody that is able to stand back and look at whatever they've got in front of them in a very objective way and distancing themselves completely from the individuals or anything that's happened in it, and just being able to look at the science and break it down and truly understand what the science means and then present it.
The version of events given by Rycroft could be proved to be a lie.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, we delve into a 55-year-old murder mystery in the village of Beenham in Berkshire.
Although this is now sealed, within this bag is one of the plastic bags that were found on the floor of the barn. From my point of view, this is the raw material which enables me and my team to do our work.
And we take a trip around the world, analysing the tiny clues found on the body of murdered Leicester solicitor Vina Patel.
Just a couple of tufts of fibres leads you across the world to India, and then you go all the way back to the other side of the world to Jamaica.
Doesn't matter how old a case is, there's always a chance that the killers left something behind that which we might find now using our new techniques.
Beenham, Berkshire, 1966. 1 week after Yolanda Waddington arrives in the village to start a job as a nanny, she's found dead. Police descend on the small village.
And how's the investigation going?
Very hard work has been put into this. The whole area is alive with policemen at the present time.
But the massive investigation never found Yolanda's killer. And for over 40 years, the case remained unsolved. Then, in 2010, Thames Valley Police began a new inquiry, this time with the added help of DNA expert witness Roy Green.
It doesn't matter how old a case is, if the exhibits still exist or retained materials still exist, then we can play our part in trying to solve it.
The reinvestigation would be led by head of the Thames Valley Police Cold Case Unit, Pete Byrne.
Around about 10 o'clock or thereabouts, Yolanda said that she wanted to go and post a letter. Went to the post box, and then having gone there, came to the pub just after 10 o'clock or thereabouts, bought a packet of cigarettes, and then left. And she didn't return, and obviously when she didn't return, she was reported missing.
Her body was discovered 2 days later, hidden near this barn. Yolanda had 2 stab wounds to her chest. Neither was fatal. The pathologist confirmed the cause of death was strangulation.
So this is where the barn was in 1966. It's now gone, but it was just over there. Say, obviously something had happened within the barn. That's where Yolanda's clothing was.
As well as clothing, police also found a knife, a comb, and blood-stained sacks.
This is good because it shows you the fertiliser sacs in situ. The blade of a broken knife that was found at the scene. He was stabbed, probably by this knife. A comb was also found. Just outside the barn, you can see the hay.
In the 1960s, forensic capability was limited, but identifications could be attempted using blood groups. Detectives believed blood found on the fertiliser sacks belonged to the killer and did their best to find a match.
Beenham's only a small village, but even so, they carried out a mass screen of all males in the village, and they tested 4,000 people.
While police waited on the results, their investigations suggested a possible suspect.
That's David Burgess in 1966. He was a 19-year-old man from Beenham. The evidence against David Burgess was the fact that he had been in the Six Bells at the time. Yolanda was there. He was seen to leave shortly afterwards. The next day, he had scratches on his face, and he said he'd fallen into a bush on the way home because he was a bit drunk. He also volunteered to the police when they found a knife at the scene, that he had lost a knife similar to that a few weeks previously.
Police were immediately suspicious, but the results of the blood sample Burgess had given did not match the blood group found on the fertiliser sacks. And then there were 2 more murders.
3 murders in 6 months. Similar murders, many people are saying. And the people in these houses, people who are peeping out from behind their curtains, are asking, when will this man be caught?
9-year-old Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams had gone out on their bikes. They never came home.
Jeanette Wigmore's body was found in a disused gravel pit just behind me here, which is now the scene of an intensive police hunt. A little later on, 2 hours later on, the body of the other child was found.
It seems rather a coincidence, you know, within a mile of each other. 3 murders in 6 months, isn't it? Yes, I think no, it's definitely a local man.
Jeanette and Jacqueline had indeed been killed by a local man, David Burgess. He was tried and convicted, but he continued to deny Yolanda's murder. And with a shortage of evidence, he was never tried. Now, 45 years later, Peter Byrne hoped modern science could help him uncover the truth. So he turned to forensic biologist and expert witness Roy Green to examine the original evidence.
You need to go back and check everything, even though something has been said to be done or something has been said to be tested. Has that been done properly?
So what we have here is the box of exhibits that were initially sent to the forensic scientists. From my point of view, this is the raw material which enables me and my team to do our work.
It was now up to the forensic scientists to go through this evidence in detail. Would Roy Green's team prove Burgess's guilt or find it was someone else entirely?
Solving old cases like this, when it's a combination of things. Firstly, you know, there is new technology. DNA is available that wasn't available previously. But also you need to look back and say, well, has everything been done as it should have been done? The more you do, the more you realise that cases are solvable.
There were only a few pieces of evidence to work with. The knife, the comb, the blood-stained sack, and of particular interest, Yolanda's headband.
That was an important item because Yolanda always wore this headband, and when she was found, she wasn't wearing it, and it was in the barn.
Roy believed this key piece of evidence may have been overlooked by the original investigation.
When we looked at the original scientist's notes, it was described as grubby. It didn't really look grubby to me, it looked more like blood.
Blood offered the potential to find the killer's DNA. This was exactly the kind of new lead the cold case team was looking for. But for Roy, it presented a scientific question.
So our first challenge was, we knew that These bloodstains were 45 years old, and we didn't really know whether any DNA profiling would work. Well, first of all, you have to find the DNA, which we did with the bloodstain. Then you have to extract the DNA from the particular material it's in. You start off with one fragment, and by the end of the process, in theory, you'll have about 4 billion. And so you are amplifying up very tiny amounts of DNA until you have enough to be able to do something with them.
There was a problem, though. The samples were nearly half a century old.
Blood being a biological material, it can degrade, and what tends to happen is that parts of the profile are lost before other parts. In order to successfully have a case go through court, you need to be able to produce the best result you can with the strongest evidence that you can.
A partial profile wasn't going to be enough to prove a match. After Roy's initial excitement, it looked like the headband had been a false start. But he and his team did not give up. Instead, they turned to the next bloodstained exhibit and tried again.
The fertiliser bag, which had been examined, and in the notes it said they were crusty bloodstains. Well, they were still there, and we've zoomed in here. You can see them still there. There's still a bloodstain there. Some of the results that were obtained were mixtures. So that was a mixture of DNA from different people in there. And they found that on the fertiliser sac there was blood that couldn't have come from the victim.
Some of the DNA was from Yolanda, but there was also a male profile, and this was sufficiently complete to try and match with the police database.
The result obtained from the fertiliser bag showed that the findings were at least 1 in a billion times more likely if the blood came from David Burgess rather than someone unrelated to him.
They had found a match. Pete Byrne finally had the evidence that David Burgess had been Yolanda's killer all along.
When I was told, I wasn't surprised. Obviously, Burgess had been a suspect in the initial investigation. Any unresolved homicide won't be forgotten, and we will do all that we can to try and get a resolution.
Burgess had been in prison since 1967 for the murders of Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams. In November 2011, he was brought in for questioning about Yolanda. Police hoped if they pushed him about the unexplained scratches, he might reveal something to back up the DNA evidence.
Did you get those scratches because Yolanda scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that, and you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said.
Burgess continued his denial, even when pressed about the knife.
We're saying the knife that you lost is identical, you say you lost, is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolanda Waddington. That's a coincidence, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife. How many people in Vina had a knife that's similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, aren't they?
In the end, the interview revealed nothing new, but the DNA evidence was still strong. In 2012, after a 5-week trial, a jury found David Burgess guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Finally, Yolanda's family had justice for their daughter.
Science was vital in solving this case. Solving a case this old brings an extra element of satisfaction, and that you are finally able to bring closure to a victim's family. And it's part of the reason why I do the job.
She was a young 17-year-old girl, a whole life ahead of her, just starting out in life with a job, starting to earn some money for herself, and it's all taken away just like that.
After Burgess's conviction, Thames Valley Police received a letter from Yolanda's father thanking them for their efforts to find her killer.
Dear Chief, let it not be said to have been a thankless task. To the lot of you who have been involved in the search for evidence leading to the jury's verdict of guilty at Reading Crown Court on Friday the 20th of July 2012, I say thank you. To the lot of you who have toiled a total of approaching 46 years seeking evidence, I say thank you. From Yolanda's daddy, yours sincerely, William Waddington. Again, 46 years later, he was still her daddy. She was still his little girl, and she'd been taken away from him all those years ago.
It's amazing that a tiny thread of a few fibres can lead to all sorts of other evidence and may even crack the case for the investigators.
Leicester, 2009. Solicitor Vina Patel is found dead, and crime journalist Nick Britton is assigned to cover the story.
Concerns were first raised by Vina's daughter, Anisha, because she was due to go and meet her after work and she hadn't turned up. After a while, they became a little bit concerned, so Anisha and her father, Vina's husband, Surendra, went round to the office. And it was then that they made this gruesome and horrifying discovery. Vina was lying at the bottom of the stairs. She was in an unnatural position. And she was, quite clearly, no longer alive.
Detectives attended the scene. They're trained never to take anything at face value, so immediately had questions.
Had she fallen down the stairs and broken her neck? Or was she murdered and placed there to make it look like an accident?
Retired detective Roy Lambert has worked on numerous major crime investigations. He knows the importance of taking the right approach early on.
In police investigations, you only get one chance of investigating and examining a scene. That's the first chance, and you need to get it right first time.
Forensic investigators examined every inch of the crime scene and noticed distinctive fibres on Vina's body. They quickly called in Roger Robson, one of the UK's leading experts in fibre analysis.
It all really revolved around some fibres, and there was a tuft hanging out from the side of her mouth. And she had one hand grasped firmly, and the fibres were sticking out between her fingers. So the inference being that something had either been used to contain her, maybe wrapped over her head, and equally, if she had been murdered and the body had been put in situ to make it look like an accident, then maybe she'd been wrapped up in something so the body could be moved.
Roger was convinced that if he could figure out the origin of these fibres, it would reveal the events leading to Vina's death.
Every contact leaves a trace, so what we're trying to do is look at items of clothing from the victim. Each fibre's usually had a bit of a journey from the manufacturing stage to where we found it. That can give it a little bit of individuality.
Roger started by running tests, analysing the exact makeup of the fibres he'd been sent.
First steps is the tuft in the mouth, the same as the tuft in her fingers. So what we do is we take the fibres and we mount them under a microscope slide. I'm looking at the morphology, the cross-sectional shape, the colour, and I'll run some tests to look at the chemical composition.
While Roger analysed the fibres, the police were also beginning to suspect foul play, so they began to look into Vina Patel's relationships, including with her business partner, John Court.
Vina Patel and John Court had been not just business partners, but great friends for 3 decades or so. They'd worked together. They were partners in a business called Court & Co. That was based in Leicester, and it was a very successful business. They were both very highly regarded in the legal profession and also by their clients.
But as detectives investigated further, they uncovered another side to John Court.
That veneer of respectability disappeared when it emerged that actually he was living an extraordinary double life. He was somebody that enjoyed a luxurious and lavish lifestyle well beyond his means and well beyond the wage that he was being paid. It also became apparent that he was visiting very expensive hotels in London, very expensive restaurants in London. He funded a penthouse flat in Leicester. He funded 2 flats in West London where he housed girlfriends, where he had a string of escorts.
Police began to look more closely at John Court's finances and those of his and Vina's business. It wasn't long before they found something very revealing.
Where was this money coming from? How could he fund this lifestyle? Well, simply by taking money out of the business, by taking money from clients. £1.1 million he took out of the business. £650,000 he took from clients' accounts.
Vina voiced her concerns to her husband and began to ask questions that for John Court were awkward to answer.
Vina Patel first became suspicious of Court when he was putting her under pressure to increase her life assurance to £1.5 million. That concern led to a chain of events which really put Court into a corner.
While police followed the money, Roger Robson followed the fibres found on Vina's body.
It was relatively easy to identify the fibres. They were blue polypropylene. However, they were really unusual because they were exceptionally thin. I'd certainly never seen any polypropylene fibres like this before. We didn't really know where these fibres had come from. There might have been an obvious answer that just led us back to Vina Patel's home life. So I have to look for other sources, if only to eliminate them. So the investigative team sent me various samples, both from the working office where Vina went daily. They also did the same thing at Vina's home address, and again, I didn't find any blue polypropylene at all. So the inference is they have something to do with the perpetrator.
The financial evidence proved John Court had a motive for killing Vina. Now, if Roger found a link between him and the blue fibres, that would connect Court to the body as well. But he found nothing.
It raised a few questions when I couldn't find the source of the fibres. You start asking, well, where have they come from then?
But Roger was not going to be able to identify the source of the fibres in his lab. For that, he would need to look further afield.
Most polypropylene fibres are manufactured specifically to go in either rope or they make carpets to be really hard wearing, just like nylon. I could see these rather nice, what we call fisheye extrusion marks along the length of the fibre. The marker at the end of the day is it's just like a fingerprint, really, specific to their brand.
Roger hoped these extrusion marks could lead him to where the fibres were manufactured. There are producers all over the world, but he started his search with a company based in Bradford.
I knew that this little company would have all the answers. They got their technical team together, and pretty much by the end of that first day, they were happy that it wasn't something that they'd produced themselves. But they felt that if we could leave the fibres with them, they knew what some of their competitors would use to mark, and that may help identify where these fibres had actually been originally manufactured.
While Roger waited for answers, the police investigation made a major breakthrough. Foreign DNA found on Vina's hand. It belonged to a friend and sometime lover of John Court, Brian Farrell. He lived 100 miles away in London, so how did his DNA end up on Vina? When police questioned him, he had an explanation.
Brian Farrell's excuse was that he had been at the office. He made no secret of the fact that he had actually been there. He said that he and Court had been having sex in the office shortly before Vina had been killed. And his DNA would have been there and that somehow got onto Vina's body either through John Court or through her desk or something like that. So to him, he said it was no surprise that his DNA was found.
It was clear DNA would not solve this case. Instead, everything was hanging on the mystery fibres, just as Roger got a call from the fibre factory in Bradford.
It took them a couple of weeks, but they were really confident that the source of these particular fibres was from a little factory in India. They had a conversation with the managing director, and sure enough, this guy had been using the very fine polypropylene fibres to make small rugs. They weren't exporting them to the UK. Indeed, they weren't exporting them to Europe, but we did find out that they were exporting them to only one outlet in Jamaica.
Detectives were left asking how a rug manufactured in India and exported to Jamaica could be key to a possible murder in Leicester. It seemed to make no sense until they looked into the travel history of Brian Farrell.
Brian Farrell had visited Jamaica shortly before Vina Patel's murder, and police believe that he had bought that rug, and he had not only brought it back to the UK, but he had used it on that night to wrap Vina Patel's body in it after he had killed her. And that was how this piece of fibre ended up on Vina Patel's body.
It was such an unusual fibre, and I felt the only way I was going to get there was to go and knock on the door of industry and speak to the manufacturers. I felt as though I'd done my bit, done a good job.
Police believe that Farrell killed Vina, wrapped her in the rug and moved her to the bottom of the stairs. It explained the fibres and the DNA. Farrell was now the prime suspect. And as detectives dug deeper, they found evidence John Court was also involved. Was Farrell acting as his hitman?
John Court had put a false appointment in Vina Patel's diary to make sure that she was in the office late that night. Later in the evening, John Court's mobile phone had phoned the office, and once he knew that Vina Patel was still there, his mobile phone was in contact with 2 of Brian Farrell's mobile phones to give him the green light to act.
The police now had enough evidence to charge both Brian Farrell and John Court for the murder of Vina Patel. On the 28th of May 2010, the pair were found guilty.
This evidence, when put together, proved beyond any sort of doubt whatsoever that these 2 men were guilty of what the judge described as a premeditated, calculated and ruthless murder.
The case was conclusive, held together by unique blue fibres.
Just a couple of tufts of fibres leads you across the world to India, and then you go all the way back to the other side of the world to Jamaica, and then all the way back to Leicester again. It just shows the powerful inferences that fibre evidence can bring to an investigation.